Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, PAL2 Advanced. Today, our presenter is Dr. Gloria McCoo. Dr. McCoo is an assessment training consultant with Pearson. She was trained as a school psychologist at Texas A&M University and at the University of Florida. She worked for 2 years as a supervisor of psychological services and for several years as a school psychologist with Guilford County Schools in North Carolina. She provided training for graduate students in school psychology at Indiana State University and Illinois State University. She worked as a psychologist in private practice in Greensboro, North Carolina. Dr. McCoo has conducted research on assessment methods and instruments, early intervention, and response to intervention. Her publications include a chapter on prematurity and children's needs, an article on full-service schools published in School Psychology Review, and several test reviews for the Burroughs Mental Measurement Yearbook. Dr. McCoo is a member of the National Association of School Psychologists, and has presented on different topics at national and state conferences. Before we begin, I would like to bring your attention to the chat on the lower left-hand side of your screen. All phones have been muted for the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it into the chat box. Within the next couple of weeks, we will send you the question and answer document with the email that you registered with today. And now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. McCoo.
Thank you, Sherry, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the PAL2. We're going to focus on some advanced components of the process assessment of the learner, the second edition. And most of the slides that I'm going to show you here today, hopefully you've received in a handout that we sent you. In addition to the slides, I also sent you a 20-page document, which is the table of contents from the user's guide of the PAL2, and I'll look at that toward the end of our time here today. What I really want to do is move away from this screen, and I want to go to my own desktop so I could show you information that I want to discuss, and I also want to show you some components from the user's guide. So if you'd hang with me for 1 second, I'll go to my desktop. Okay. You should be seeing my screen now, PowerPoint presentation, PAL2 Advanced, and I'm going to talk about the tiered assessment and intervention components that Dr. Berninger describes as part of the process assessment of the learner. In terms of what I'd like to accomplish here today, and in addition to everything I'm going to talk about, I'd also like to be able to respond to any specific questions that you have, because when you think about this, and it is a system, I was going to say instrument, but it really is a comprehensive system, and there are so many components, and I've pulled out most of the components because I want you to get a perspective of how you can use the components in an integrated fashion. But at the same time, there are so many components, and you might have some specific questions. I want to be sure that I have some time to respond to your questions. As I talk through the presentation, if you would enter your questions in the chat box, and I'll try to monitor that as I'm moving back and forth to make sure that I respond to your questions either today or later in a written document. What I'd like to do today is describe the reading, the writing, and the math skills that students theoretically are expected to master at specific grade levels. It's important for us to understand which specific skills a student is able to master, because essentially what we want to ascertain is whether or not students are indeed mastering those specific skills. For students who are not mastering the skills at a specific grade levels, we might want to further assess the cognitive processes that are critical to the acquisition of reading, writing, and math skills. It may be that I'm struggling with a specific component of reading, for example, because of one of the fundamental cognitive processes that is required to perform that skill. And I'll talk about these cognitive processes related to reading, writing, as well as math. Then I'm going to talk about how you would use the data from the assessment to choose an intervention. And you would analyze the assessment data both on the skill components as well as the related cognitive processes components, and how you'd use those data to choose an intervention that would target the identified area of weakness, the identified skill deficit. Everything that I'm going to talk about here today is based on the work of Dr. Virginia Berninger, who's the author of the Process Assessment of the Learner, and we now have the second edition. The second edition is available for reading, writing, as well as math. If you're familiar with the original Process Assessment of the Learner, that was available for reading and writing only. We added the math component with this second edition that we published in 2007. The Process Assessment of the Learner, as I mentioned, is a comprehensive system. I'm going to talk about both the assessment component, which is research-based, and I'm also going to talk about the interventions component, to which the PAL2 reading and writing is linked. So I'll talk about the evidence-based interventions and lessons that are available for the reading and writing components, and I'll describe how you can use the instruments at 3 tiers. We'll start with Tier 1, looking at prevention, how you could use the instruments to actually identify students who are struggling and to use some of the evidence-based interventions to improve their skills. And then I'll talk about Tier 2, problem-solving consultation, maybe between a school psychologist and a teacher, for example. And then we'll also look at how you'd use the data for differential diagnosis. And I'll talk, when I look at differential diagnosis, I'll look at both reading, writing, and math. But often when I think about differential diagnosis and maybe a weakness in spelling, you're thinking about both of those as related to written language. And if a student is struggling with reading, for example, a student may be struggling to name words accurately for different or to comprehend. That's probably a better example. If you think about comprehension, I may be struggling to comprehend information that I read for several different reasons. It may be because of a weakness in vocabulary. I don't know what the words that I'm naming. I don't know what those words mean. Or it might be because I can't really decode or name the words. So we'll talk about the different components, the different cognitive processes that are fundamental to reading, and how you'd evaluate performance on some of those processes to maybe differentially diagnose. This is the visual representation of the PAL2. The PAL2, as I mentioned, available for 3 broad subject areas, and looking at Tier 1, where we're focusing on preventing reading, writing, and math problems by intervening as soon as we recognize there is a problem. For students who continue to struggle despite the early intervention at Tier 1, those students might be referred to Tier 2, where maybe a school psychologist or an educational diagnostician is engaged in problem-solving consultation with the teacher, and we're looking at specific referral questions. And we'll talk about how you could use the PAL2 to look at the specific referral question, select assessment components or subtests that would give you the information that you need to maybe become more specific in terms of the intervention. And then certainly at Tier 3, we're again looking at linking treatment or intervention. In this case, we want to make sure that our treatment planning is based on differential diagnosis. So, for example, if an individual is struggling with comprehension because of a weakness in vocabulary, the intervention is going to be different than that for a student who is struggling with comprehension because he or she cannot name the words. So we'll talk about that differential diagnosis. So let me start first by telling you a little bit about the skills that we expect students theoretically. And of course, this is going to vary depending on the school district. But theoretically, there are certain skills that we expect students to master at specific grade levels. So we want to make sure that we assess those grade level skills in reading, writing, and math identify students who are not mastering those skills, and for those students, assessing further to identify the component cognitive processes that might be leading to that inability to demonstrate this skill. So first, let me look at reading. If you look at reading, ultimately, we want students, as adults as well, we want to read for meaning. We want to read to learn. But before you can get to the place here, silent reading fluency, where you're able to coordinate silent word recognition and sentence comprehension processes when reading for meaning, and you're able to do so fluently, in order to get to that stage, there are a number of component skills that will lead you to that comprehension where you're able to name the words quickly and accurately, and where you're able to demonstrate comprehension while you're reading. In order to demonstrate silent reading fluency, and here's an example, just to give you an example of the tasks that are included in the POW2. And I did not pull out too many of the tasks because I'm not focusing on the assessment here today. I'm really talking about how you will use the system in an integrated fashion. But in this particular case, for example, where you want the individual to be able to look at these 3 sentences and to identify the sentence that actually communicates the meaning. So the little girl lost her new brush and comb, or did she lose her new brush and comb, or did she lost it, or did she last it? So again, you're trying to see if the examinee is able to integrate silent word recognition and comprehension at the same time, to do so effortlessly and fluently. In order to be able to demonstrate silent reading fluency, there are a number of component skills. Certainly, students should be able to decode new, unfamiliar words that they encounter in reading. And so often when we're assessing, because the referral concerns reading, especially basic reading skills, one of the things that we want to assess is the individual's ability to name words that are phonetically regular but that are not meaningful. So either pseudo words or non-words. Dr. Berninger refers to those as Jabberwocky words. So words that would lend themselves to phonological decoding. And then you also want to be able to see if individuals are able to pronounce words when different suffixes are added to the same base word, or maybe you add a different prefix. And it's really important because in terms of reading or language, what is stored in our memory? We store the mental representation of a word in memory. And so when we move to morphology or the morphological component, we're moving closer and closer to meaning, because word parts essentially could change the meaning of a word. If you add the ing to a word, for example, that's probably not as good an example as if you had the ed added to a verb, and then you add an s to a verb. For example, if I were to say, I worked at ISU, or he worked at ISU, and he works at ISU, theoretically, these two statements could not be correct at the same time, theoretically, right? Except, I guess in this case, it is possible because he could have worked at Indiana State University and is now working at Illinois State University. So theoretically, when you add a suffix or a prefix, that word part actually changes the meaning of words. And so what we want students to do is to gradually move away from the phoneme component, isolating each individual sound in a word, for example, moving to recognizing word parts and larger word parts, so that they can use syllabication when they come to words that they don't know. But what if you're working with an individual in grade 1 where the focus is on phonological decoding and a student is not able to perform that particular skill? What are some of the component processes that might be contributing to underachievement in that area? Well, if you think about reading, reading really looks at a number of component processes. And I mentioned before that when you think about reading, the primary component is the single word. That is the basic unit in which we represent language in our own mental dictionary. It's at that word level. But if you think about the word level, at a higher level is connected text, looking at text and how you would use word combinations, maybe in sentences, maybe in paragraphs, maybe in discourse, if I wanted to write a narrative, for example, or if I wanted to read a narrative essay written by somebody else. So certainly if you think about reading in terms of development in a curriculum, for example, ultimately, this is our goal. We want individuals to be able to read connected text and to gain knowledge or to learn from what they're reading. And typically when you're thinking about reading at the text level, we start out with the oral reading, but ultimately what we want is that silent reading fluency to which I referred earlier. So with silent reading, you want to be able to understand, and understanding is directly correlated to the fluency. If I'm able to name the words quickly and accurately, effortlessly, if you will, while I'm naming these words or while I'm reading silently, I'm actually getting the meaning. Probably know some students who struggle to name words fluently, effortlessly. Those students are using most of their cognitive energy to decode the words, leaving them with very little cognitive energy to focus on the meaning while they're reading. So the rate or fluency is really important because you want them to be getting the meaning as they're reading. In order to get to this silent reading fluency, we want to make sure that they are, in fact, naming the words accurately. And so in this case, we also use the oral reading. And you'll notice, for example, when we start teaching reading, we typically focus on oral reading, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and then third grade, toward the end of third grade, is when we really focus more on reading to learn. Here, we're focusing more on learning to read, if you will. And ultimately, what we want with oral reading, we want you to be able to name the words accurately. We want you to be able to name them quickly. And then we want you to be able to read fluently with prosody so that I know as you're reading, you're understanding the text. And then ultimately, we're going to ask you some comprehension questions. But what if I'm in fourth grade and I'm struggling with silent reading comprehension? You want to make sure that you go back to the word component, and also you might need to go even further back to the subword component. The subword is really lower than the single word. These are the codes for sounds and letters which we must integrate in a single word. So often some children struggle to link sound to symbol, which is this alphabetic principle. You see a word and you encode the visual representation of the word, and you segment each of these symbols. You associate a sound with each symbol, so you segmentation, and then synthesis. You put them together. So in essence, I think I've often heard teachers say, well, say it slow, b-e-d, now say it fast. So you're looking at the segmentation and the blending. And this is what should happen if you're thinking about reading. When children come to school, they bring with them the knowledge of oral language. They have mastered, well, to some extent, language by ear, receptive language, and language by mouth, expressive language. And what we want to do when they enter school is link the oral language to the written language, and we do so with reading as well as writing. So if you think about the alphabet principle that requires the integration of the phonological and the orthographic, it may be that I'm not able to name a word because of a weakness in either phonological or maybe in orthographic. So you may need to assess even further below that word level, go to the subword level to see if a student is able maybe to hear or to recognize the syllables in a word, to recognize the phonemes in a word, and maybe even further back, can she hear rhyming words? Can she produce a rhyming word, for example? All part of that phonological awareness component. And then looking at the onset and the rhyme and also syllable types. So, for example, if you're working with the onset b and the rhyme ad, theoretically, if I have stored this rhyme in my short-term memory, the only part of the word on which I need to focus would be the initial consonant. So if you change that to D, for example, this is already at the level of automaticity. All I need to focus on would be this individual sound. So the phonological awareness certainly is an important component of reading. The orthographic awareness, the ability to encode visual representations, to store those in short-term memory, and then maybe a second later, if I show you that letter, can you recognize that in a series of letters? Can you identify that this is the letter that you saw a second ago? And then, as I indicated, you want to be able to link the phonological with the orthographic. I want to talk just a little bit about the importance of linking phonological and orthographic, because I think when you look, for example, at reading, see if I can get out of this for 1 second. I want to show you a different document. When you think about reading, there are so many components that are involved in reading. And this is one of the documents that I'm going to show you later on because it's part of that user's guide. If you think in terms of reading, writing, as well as math, all three require us to integrate or to create cross-code connections of several different kinds of information. So here, for example, if you're thinking about reading, you want to be able to link the orthographic, the visual symbols, to the phonological. You want to be able to identify a letter and associate that with a certain sound. To the extent that we have created these cross-code connections, the connections between the orthographic and the phonological, we are able to name words quickly and fluently. We want to make sure that those cross-code connections are really created quickly and that within verbal working memory or verbal working memory is able to react quickly. So you think about the rapid automatic naming, possibly rapid automatic switching, are all important when you're thinking about moving from the orthographic to the phonological and the other way around as well. Because if you think about reading, you're looking at the symbol first and you are associating that with a sound. If you think about spelling, on the other hand, uses the same two component processes, but typically for spelling, we encode the phonological first. You say the word, he slept in his bed, and you're hearing it, you're processing, you're coding the sounds, you're coding what you hear, you're isolating each sound, and theoretically, you are able to write that word. And if you're focusing on phonological, you are probably going to write the word exactly the way it sounds. And for some words that are phonetically regular, that'll work quite effectively. In the English language, though, for so many words, the sounds and the symbols disagree. So in addition to storing, to processing the information, you must be able, when you hear certain words, to retrieve the visual representation from your verbal working memory or from your long-term memory. Because many words, if you think, for example, hemorrhage, well, hemorrhage, if I write that the way it sounds, when somebody tells me that a person he was hospitalized because of a cerebral hemorrhage, then what's going to help me to write that word is not the link between the phonological and the orthographic. It's really the context, the morphological, that's going to be important. I'm using different word parts. I'm using context to generate meaning, and based on the meaning, I understand how that word should be written or what that word should look like. If we create these cross-code connections between the phonological, the orthographic, and the morphological, this connected piece right here, that is the autonomous orthographic lexicon, and that is what allows us to name words fluently. When I see a word and I can recognize I have this word stored in my memory as a single unit, and I can retrieve that word quickly. So the more words that are part of your autonomous orthographic lexicon, the more fluently you're going to be able to read. Okay, get back to this here for a second. Okay, I'm going to scoot back to one place here, and then I'm going to move on. Okay, so if you think about the word-specific processes then, reading words, there are two different components to reading words. If you're going to be able to read fluently, you should be able to recognize words quickly. And to recognize words quickly, you pretty much have to store these within that autonomous orthographic lexicon. So we work first on the accuracy, and then we work on the automaticity. You should be able to name that word effortlessly. But we also want, so this is going to lead us to fluent reading. But in addition, we want individuals to be able to read independently. So they come to a word that they've never seen, they should employ this phonological decoding mechanism to figure out what that word is. So, for example, if I'm talking about the orthographic autonomous lexicon, maybe what I do if I've never seen that word before, maybe I break it into its component syllables and then I put those together. So being able to decode remains important because it's the way that we're able to recognize words that we've never seen before, or to name words we've never seen before. And when you think about the meaning, morphological awareness, really, if you think about compound words, words that are made up of two words with which you are already familiar, certainly that's going to be helpful. Again, using the context to be able to name those words, should be able to segment syllables, should be able to look at the roots of words, maybe looking at base words with affixes, prefixes, suffixes. You should also be able to transform morphological components to the sounds and to put those two together to name words. And then also stress and intonational patterns and their relationship to spelling rules are important. And ultimately, what is needed to read certainly would be those language skills that we talk about here with morphological awareness, but also vocabulary. If you can name the words, do you know what they mean? So all of that is going to be used to take you to the ultimate silent reading, where you're reading effortlessly and you're understanding while you're reading. But comprehension requires more. Comprehension sometimes is based on what you know about the topic that's being presented. So you have to search your long-term memory to see if you have some background knowledge related to that topic. Also, you're thinking about language processes that are involved. Are you aware that if I have a question mark, or if my tone of voice is a certain way, that implies I'm asking you a question, for example? What about cognitive processes? Are you able to encode the information that you hear, the information that you see? Are you able to link the sound to the symbol? And also, are you able to monitor and regulate your own behavior as you're reading? If you are not getting the meaning, do you know that you need to stop and maybe reread or do something differently? If you think about writing and reading require the same component processes. But if you think about writing, the ultimate goal, just like reading, is to write to give information. So I need to be able to organize and present my ideas logically and coherently in such a way that I communicate to other people. But in order to do that, there are a number of components that are involved. The first is the output for this task is going to be in written form. So it's going to be really important for us to be able to write down the words that we can say. So handwriting is an important writing skill, a skill that's unique to the writing component. And then also when you think about spelling, you're really thinking about orthographic spelling because of that disconnect sometimes between sound and symbol. So it's not enough to write the word exactly the way you hear it. You also need to be able to retrieve from your memory a visual representation of the word. For writing, some of the component processes that we want to teach certainly are transcription skills and then ultimately text generation. So we want you to write an essay, a narrative, or an expository essay, for example. Or are you able to organize and plan? Or are you able to translate what you're saying in your head using oral language? Or are you able to translate that to writing? Or are you able to review and revise? And some of the component skills that are necessary and that might actually adversely impact written production might be spelling. If I write words that are so severely misspelled, the reader may not be able to understand what you're presenting. And certainly handwriting, if there's a weakness with fine motor skills, that could impact that component as well. So if you think about the reading and writing processes, certainly the ability to code visual representations in your short-term memory and then to consolidate and move those to long-term memory is going to be important. The importance of identifying parts of words that you hear, whether syllables, whether the onset and the rhyme, whether at the phoneme level, certainly the ability to code what you're hearing in short-term memory and then again transferring that to long-term memory. And then being able to code based on grammatical components, word parts, and the structure of a sentence. If I begin a sentence with a verb, I'm probably going to ask you a question. Well, unless I'm saying I'm using a command, for example, if I say feed the dog, that is a command where the subject is understood. But if I'm using this form of a verb, I'm probably going to ask you a question. So again, thinking about grammar and syntax. And then what we need to do when we're coding or making these connections in our memory, we need to be able to do those quickly. We store something, we act on it in verbal working memory. Like right now when I look at this word, I'm acting on it in verbal working memory, but I'm able to do that quickly because this is part of my autonomous orthographic lexicon. So the ability to name words rapidly, rapid automatic naming, the ability to switch back and forth rapidly, maybe from a number to a letter, that's really important. And then because we're looking at written output sometimes, certainly the oral motor planning is important as well as finger sense. From math, you're thinking about certainly a number of component processes or skills that we expect children to master. But learning math requires certainly performance of skills, but it really requires us to continually integrate conceptual knowledge and procedural knowledge. So, for example, if you're asking me to add two numbers, certainly I should understand the concept of addition, that the result is going to be larger than either of the two numbers, but I should also understand the process in which I need to engage in order to add the two numbers. So if you look at the skills that we're measuring with the PAL-2, we start out with oral counting, basic one-to-one correspondence, moving to fact retrieval, And ultimately, with fact retrieval, what you want is for fact retrieval, just like reading words, you want that to be effortless. You want it to be automatic. You also want the individual to be able to perform different operations, adding, subtracting, and again, you want the individual to perform at a level of automaticity or fluency. Place value and part-whole relationships are all important when we're thinking about fractions and decimals. Place value is really important, helps children to understand how to perform math calculations. And then multi-step problem solving, again, being able to use your verbal working memory to solve a number of different problems. But in order to perform these skills, there are a number of math-related processes that might interfere with the individual's ability to perform those skills. So maybe I'm struggling with the output demand. I can't write the numbers. I hear you say one. I encode the sounds, but I have yet to associate that symbol with that word that you just used. I'm not able to code the number symbols. For example, you show me 2, and then you turn the page and you show me a 2 in conjunction with maybe a number of other numbers. Are you able to recognize that this is the one that you just coded in your short-term memory? What about quantitative working memory? Are you able to hold in memory the numbers, mentally manipulate those numbers? What about spatial working memory? And then again, you want that component to proceed effortlessly. So the ability to name digits and double digits rapidly, and also when you're thinking about switching back and forth between words and digits. And then again, the output will require that writing component. And it might be that I can perform the operation, and if you were to ask me to tell you the answer, I could. But in this case, you were asking me to write it down, and my fine motor abilities are limited, for example. Okay, let me just scoot back to here to see if I have any questions. Okay, let me go back to my desktop. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how you'd use the PAL2 at the 3 tiers. The first is looking at early intervention. If you look at early intervention, okay, what's up here? Okay. In one of the documents in the PAL2, there's a document called Tier 1 Early Intervention for Reading and Writing. Within that document, we list, or Dr. Berninger lists the skills in the core curriculum that students theoretically should master at certain grade levels. So if you look here, for example, in kindergarten, and you're thinking about this for reading, we expect students to be able to perform some of those subword skills, to be able to name letters accurately, to be able to identify rhyming words or recognize rhyming words, and also generate rhyming words, and to be able to recognize syllables as well as the onset phoneme segmentation for certain words. So you say a word and you ask me to identify the syllables, cow, boy, for example. At grade 1, you're focusing on the ability to name real words accurately as well as name pseudo words accurately. So again, we're focusing on real words, which if we master enough real words, that'll become part of the autonomous orthographic lexicon, and we wouldn't have to think when we get to those words. But you also want the individual to be able to decipher or decode the word he or she encounters when that's not a new word. When you look at grade 2, for example, you notice we've added to the accuracy, we've now added the fluency component. We want you to be able to name these words accurately, but now we also want you to be able to do so fluently. When you get to grade 3, looking at accuracy and rate of reading real words, accuracy and rate of reading pseudo words, we're also moving to silent decoding and silent reading fluency. And then for grade 4 and above, and the PAL2 goes up to grade 6. So 4, 5, and 6, we're focusing on comprehension. Comprehension of words, sentences, as well as connected text in paragraph form. If you look here on this printout, what you'll see is that for each of these grade levels, there is a screening test that you would want to administer to make sure that every student in a certain classroom is in fact meeting the curriculum objectives. So let's say a student in grade 1. What you want to administer is any measure that will allow you to describe the student's ability to name real words and the student's ability to name pseudo words. You notice that we've identified 2 different tests here, but really you can use any measure of word reading, any measure of pseudo word decoding. If you look at grade 2, for example, if you're thinking about Tier 1, the universal screening for at-risk readers, you're looking at the pseudo-word decoding. I still want to know that you're able to decode the words, but we're also now looking at morphological decoding. And then at grade 3, you would look at pseudo-word decoding, also the morphological decoding fluency, find the true fixes, and also sentence sense. I'm going to pretend like I'm working with a student in grade 1 for purposes of this presentation. So the concern would be, is the student able to name real words accurately, and is the student able to name pseudo words accurately? I've administered these screening measures. I've identified a few students who are not meeting the curriculum objective. And in step 3 in that same document, Response to Early Intervention for Reading, what we do on this one is we direct you to additional assessments that will allow you to pinpoint the processing deficits in at-risk readers. So once I've identified, based on the skills assessment, that there may be 3 or 4 students in my classroom who are not mastering that skill, what I want to know now is why. Which specific component processes, and those might be different for the 4 students, but which component processes are interfering with the student's ability to name words accurately and to name pseudo words accurately. So you'll notice for grade 1, we ask you to administer from PAL 2 several different subtests: orthographic coding, phonological coding, as well as rapid automatic naming of letters and letter groups. Why? Because we know that to name the words, especially the pseudo words, what you need to do is encode the orthographic, the visual representation of the word, and to associate each letter with a sound. But fundamental to that linking sound and symbol, is the ability to hear the sounds or to hear the syllables within a word. So if that is where the breakdown is occurring, phonological coding will provide you the information that you need. Typically, if you are concerned about accuracy, the student is not able to name the words accurately, more than likely they'll also struggle with fluency. But you may administer the rapid automatic naming task, and you may find that the student is able to respond quickly to letters. Maybe not so much letter groups, but certainly you want to administer that component because ultimately we want a child to be able to name the words fluently. You may also administer a vocabulary test because, again, if a word is part of my speaking vocabulary, I'm more likely to be able to associate the written word with a word with which I'm already familiar. So that's another component because vocabulary is really important when you're thinking about reading. But let's say you administer maybe orthographic coding, phonological coding, rapid automatic naming of letters, and you find that the 4 individuals are in fact struggling with both the orthographic as well as the phonological. The early intervention for at-risk readers, we list right here all of the lessons that would be appropriate to help individuals to perform more effectively on orthographic coding, phonological coding, and to do so fluently. So notice over here, we have listed for you from PAL 2003, which is research-based reading and writing lessons, you would use as a teacher or maybe a reading specialist working with a child, you'd use lesson set 1, and the objective of this lesson set is to improve accuracy and rate of reading monosyllabic words. Then you could also use PAL Lesson Set 2, and this focuses on reading accurately and fluently polysyllabic words. And then PAL Lesson Set 11 focuses on what we can do to help a student become a functional reader. This is really the subword component to which I referred earlier. So looking at linguistic awareness, looking at decoding, fluency, comprehension in beginning reading. I'm going to show you just a few examples of some of these. As you're implementing these lessons, you want to make sure that you monitor the students' progress. And there are a number of charts that are included with the PAL research-based reading and writing lessons to monitor and plot the students' performance. If you look at the universal screening for writing, same concept. What are the skills theoretically that you expect me to master at a certain grade level? Again, I'm going to focus on grade 1. You expect the students to be able to write letters legibly, automatically. They should be able to write them from memory as well as from models. You also want to teach them to use the letters, to use words to express their ideas. So narrative compositional fluency is a component that's required at every grade level. If you look at grade 2, again, you're looking at the ability to write the letters legibly and automatically, to integrate letters to make words, spelling, and then also the narrative compositional fluency. Again, you look here and you'll see the screening test that you would administer to every student. If you're thinking about grade 1, for example, the alphabet writing, looking at copying sentences, paragraphs, the spelling task, as well as narrative compositional fluency. Really short subtests that'll give you the information you need to identify which students in grade 1 are struggling with the demands of the curriculum. Again, once you identify hopefully 3 or 4 students who are struggling with the skill or the curriculum objective, you look at the additional assessment to pinpoint the processing deficits. And on this one, look at receptive coding, word choice, PAL2, the syllables, phonemes. Again, you're looking at both the receptive coding, which is orthographic, syllables, and phonemes, which is phonological. And then here, 2 components that look at the output, the kinesthetic visual component here, or the visual motor integrative demand. And what are you going to do if you identify that a student is struggling because of a weakness in most of these components? Again, you go to the lesson set that's going to teach students to write, and that'll focus on some of these fundamental cognitive processes. So in this case, PAL Lesson Set 3, that focuses on producing letters automatically and using letters in words to write a short story. So here is just an example that I pulled out to show you how this is presented in the research-based reading and writing lessons. So I should use Tier 1, Lesson Set 1, the beginning reading, and essentially the skill on which I'm working is helping the student to link the phoneme to the grapheme. So you're looking at the phoneme or the grapheme, the letter, to the phoneme direction, and you're looking at the link, and the alphabetic principle will teach explicitly the link between the grapheme and the phoneme. Dr. Berninger includes as part of this system the Talking Letters guide, and that establishes sound to symbol. We tell you what time. These are actually written like lesson plans, the way teachers would typically write a lesson plan. So the estimated time, all the materials that you need are included there as well. Notice that All of these lessons will focus on all three levels. We'll focus on the subword level, then we'll focus on the word level, and for the word level, we'll ask the student to apply the alphabetic principle to read monosyllabic words. Again, the teacher can construct a card deck. The lists are presented in that research-based reading and writing lesson. There's a reproducibles guide, and again, the time is indicated for you. And then we're going to look at the text level. We'll ask students to read stories, oral reading, reading for personal meaning. We tell you what materials you're going to need, how much time to allocate. In all of the materials that are listed here, well, most of them are included as part of the PAL2. The talking letters, student desk guide is, the word families list is as well. The information for the word card deck is presented in that reproducible packet as well. The only thing that's not included, we tell teachers they can use any paperback books, beginning level paperback books, and Dr. Berninger gives a list of some of the books that are beginning level reading books, but teachers can choose whatever they want. This is the talking letters guide, and there's a side, this one is for consonants, and you'll notice that we have associated with each of the letters. In this case, you have the C for cat, and you also have the C for circle. In all of these, the letters, some of them are presented individually, which represents that the letter or the sound comes, the sound is the first in that letter. On this one, for example, you notice two little dots down here by the S, and that's because the sound comes at the end of that letter, so bees. And then I think there's also one where the sound is in the middle, which represented by one right here, tiger, and there's another one, I think, bird right here. So you want to make sure, and the directions actually tell you to point out these components to students as they're reading. In this one, bed, so they know that that little dot represents something. So these are the monosyllabic word cards, and you can either use these as a card, or maybe you can get it on a transparency, or you can use these words and cut them out to create individual word cards. But you'll notice here that the word is presented first as separate units. You can see the spacing, and we'll ask students to focus on these individual graphemes and to associate a sound with each grapheme. So say it slow, if you will, and then on the back side would be the whole word where we ask you to say it fast. So segmentation and blending of monosyllabic words. There's also a component for you to progress monitor. You're going to use lists 1 and 2 to teach, and then you use lists 3 and 4 to progress monitor. There's a growth graph that you can use to chart progress. Most people, I think, would actually use something on a computer, maybe an Excel spreadsheet. There are also attention motivation ratings that you can use to motivate students. This is the growth graph. This would be the attention motivation ratings, all provided in that reading, writing component. And then you're looking at the subword level, specific directions for you to introduce the talking letters. Essentially, the pictures will give you clues about the sounds that go with 1 or 2 letters. Look where I'm pointing, first to 1 or 2 letters, then to a picture. And again, specific directions. You want to make sure the child is paying attention, listen, and then you take a turn as the teacher, and then the student takes a turn. So you practice these. Starting out for this particular lesson, lesson set 1, we're only looking at the first 2 rows, the 1-letter consonants. And then at the word level, you're looking at each spelling unit, again, saying it slow. You point to it, then you have the child look and listen as the teacher shows, then the child should point, should name, should say, and then you say it fast. And then at the text level, we ask children to read text together in parallel, kind of like choral reading. And then you want to discuss the book, what they liked and didn't like, what they thought was surprising or funny. You want to encourage them to read for pleasure and to allow the child to express his or her feelings. So again, looking at all three levels. And then progress, monitor. And if you need to use, if the children are still struggling after you presented the monosyllabic words, you may also want to present the polysyllabic words, and those directions are consistent with the ones I showed you for the monosyllabic words. Okay. You also want to look at handwriting. Writing and reading go together. So in this one, you want to make sure that students learn to form the letters correctly, that they practice committing the letters to automatic pilot. They practice writing the letters from memory. They use letters to write a short composition. Again, there is a lesson plan focused on the subword level, part to the word level, and then the text level. And I'll just show you here what that looks like. So in this one, you notice that we actually would like students to start and follow these directions here. So you do that part first, and then you go. So real explicit, systematic way to teach students to write their letters, handwriting. Okay. And then at the word level, you ask the child to copy these letters as quickly as he or she can. And then this would be an example of the prompt that you'd use. Basic, short prompt in asking the child to maybe write a word or two. My school is nice, or something. And then these would be the lessons to focus on becoming a functional reader. And at the subword level, you look at all components, the phonological, the orthographic, the link between the two, as well as the morphological component. And the directions are stated explicitly for you. For phonological awareness, you clap the syllables and finger count phonemes in spoken Jabberwocky words. The orthographic awareness, the alphabetic principle, uses the talking letters. And then the morphological awareness, really getting students to recognize that parts of a word communicate important information. So, for example, the inflectional suffix that would indicate past tense, maybe a compound word, so that they understand that morphology is really an important component of reading. At the word level, you're looking at Jabberwocky words, also word families, maybe ILD as a word family, for example, and then looking at also specific words. And then at the text level, teacher-guided oral reading, similar to what we discussed with lesson set 1. And the same concept for math at Tier 1. If you look at grade 1, for example, you expect them to be able to write their numbers legibly, just as you expect them to be able to write their letters legibly. They should be able to count forward and backwards by variable increments. They should be able to perform paper and pencil written calculation. Again, what are the subtests that you'll use to identify students who are not able to perform these skills? PAL2 numeral writing, oral counting, maybe numerical operations from the WIAT 3. And again, we've listed those up to grade 6. You've identified 3 or 4 students who are struggling. What additional assessments would you need to administer in order to pretty much describe why the individual student is not able to perform that specific skill? These processing components allow us to identify more specifically the reason for underachievement in a specific area. So looking at place value, numeric coding, quantitative working memory, PAL2, rapid automatic naming of single digits, maybe the arithmetic from risk 4. And again, based on performance on these cognitive components, you want to use what we list here for the early intervention. So teach the child to write numbers from models and from memory. Maybe there's a number line on the student's desk, 100 activities, the scholastic 100 activities kids need to do by first grade. What about place value? And again, you want to make sure that you continue to monitor. So for numeral writing, for example, Dr. Berninger has listed some different recommendations. Give the child models with numbered arrows, just like we did for the letters, that show how to form the numeral in terms of which strokes to make, in what order to make them. Once the child can form each of the 10 numerals legibly, move to activities that develop automaticity of numeral writing. Ask the child to write each of the numerals from this dictation in a random order. Ask the child to write the numbers that come before and after. Again, the ordering is important. So that's Tier 1. Okay. Let me see here, for example. All right. So I'm going to go to Tier 2, and essentially on this one, any individual at Tier 1 who did not respond to the specific interventions that you implemented would be referred to Tier 2, where we're going to focus more specifically on the reason for the referral. So on this one, again, standard procedures like interviewing the referring teacher, conducting observations, maybe administering standardized norm tests to identify more specifically the nature of the reading problem, administering process measures for deficient reading skills, and then meeting with the teacher, scheduling meetings, and so on. Again, in the PAL2, the manual, we have specific referral concerns, and based on the referral concern, in this case, the child cannot figure out how to decode unknown words. So I can't do it. So I'm here at this level looking at accuracy. So we're not yet at rate. He can't do it accurately. How do I know this? Because I administered PAL2 reading pseudo-word accuracy. I also administered from the YS3 pseudo-word reading. And one of these, you only need to administer one or any other measure of pseudo-word decoding. This is the skill that the student is not able to perform. We tell you in the manual, once you've identified a skill deficit, you want to be able to explain why. Dr. Berninger contends that once we understand why a child is underachieving, we know exactly what to do. So you see if it is a breakdown at the level of receptive coding. I see all of these symbols, and I'm not encoding or registering the symbols correctly, or maybe I am, but I'm losing that symbol. It's not being moved to my long-term memory, so I don't know that again tomorrow. Or maybe it is phonological at the level of syllables, or maybe at the level of phonemes. So essentially, for receptive coding, if the child the child's score on receptive coding is low, essentially the child probably struggles to encode written words into temporary memory and then to segment the units of the written word in working memory. For syllables, poor phonological awareness of the syllables in multisyllabic spoken words, and then poor awareness of the phonemes in spoken words. So again, what Dr. Berninger has done is for each of these components, there are specific instructional activities. If the breakdown is at the level of receptive coding, for example, how can you teach receptive coding? So let's say, for example, these are the data that I generated for a student who was struggling with the naming of words, pseudo words. Notice the scale score here is 5. So based on that weakness at the skill level, I try to understand what might be causing that breakdown. So looking at syllables, for example, the scale score is 6, mean 10, standard deviation 3, phonemes 8, and receptive coding is an 8. So based on this information, we actually started first, we implemented an intervention to improve the student's phonological awareness, the ability to recognize the syllables that he hears in multisyllabic words. Once we implemented that intervention, we monitored progress, didn't make very much progress, because I think what is really happening with this individual, you look at receptive coding, an 8, phonemes, an 8. Typically, if you think about phonological awareness, the ability to recognize syllables actually develops earlier than the ability to recognize the individual sounds. So it's unusual for a child to have a lower score on syllables than on phonemes. But I think what's really causing the breakdown here is not as much the isolated orthographic component or the isolated phonological component. It's really the link between the phonological and the orthographic, which is what is necessary to name these pseudo words. So we implemented that intervention, focusing just on phonological awareness, didn't make too much progress, but what we did is we used Dr. Berninger's lessons, asking the child to find a word that's hidden in a longer word, say the syllable missing from a word he hears, say a word without a word part, say a new word by substituting a given syllable. We reviewed, he hadn't made much progress, didn't make as much progress as the other two students in the group, so we changed the intervention and we actually implemented that alphabetic principle. We provided explicit instruction in translating the printed to the spoken word, and we worked with him individually. He did make much more progress based on this intervention, but even so, he wasn't progressing at the rate that will allow him to meet the curriculum objective by the end of the year. So we referred him actually to Tier 3. And these would be the talking letters like I showed you before. We monitored progress. We wanted him, you notice right here, the goal was for him to learn 2 new words. He actually learned 1 new word. He should have learned 2 new words per week, and he learned 1 new word per week. So even though we noticed that he was making progress, the rate of improvement was lower than it should be in order for him to meet the school-wide objective for that particular end of the year. So in this case, you notice here, you notice the upward trend, which is a good thing, but the gap between the expected growth and the actual growth remained wide. Okay. So we used that information to make a decision, and we certainly recognized the steady progress. We also recognized it was slow, and we decided he was not on track to meet benchmark expectations. We referred to Tier 3. Tier 3 will allow you to differentially diagnose, especially if a child is struggling with reading and writing. Is it because of the written demand of those 2 activities, reading and writing? Is it because of the vocabulary demand for writing? Is it because of the output demand? So on this one, for example, if we look at this same young man, we want to know, referring to Tier 3, whether or not his performance meets diagnostic criteria for a written language learning disability. And the other question certainly is going to be, what can we do to improve his achievement in reading and spelling? The differential diagnosis piece allows you to look at all of the components that are required to read and all of the components that are required to write. So if you think about language certainly is oral. It's also written. And for oral, part of oral language is receptive, listening comprehension. Part of oral language is expressive. Similarly, for written language, part of written language is receptive. I read, I understand, and part of written language is expressive. You ask me to express my ideas in writing. So sometimes an individual may struggle with the receptive demands, or they may struggle more with the expressive demands compared to the receptive demands. But if you think about reading, for example, and I want to just go on with this reading example, a child may have a weakness in reading for different reasons. It may be because of, if I compare reading and spelling to verbal comprehension, word reading and spelling may be a relative weakness. But handwriting and or spelling also may be impaired relative to verbal comprehension. Language processing and verbal expression may be impaired. So it might be a weakness in basic skills, word reading and spelling, the link between the orthographic and the phonological. It might be because of the output demand, handwriting and or spelling both require that output demand. or it might be because of a weakness in language overall, a weakness in both oral language and written language. So if you think about written language, there are three kinds of specific learning disabilities that affect written language. One of these is the specific reading disability, where the weakness is in basic reading skills, and the other two are an oral and written language learning disability. So a weakness in language overall impacts the comprehension in reading, or it might be dysgraphia. Let me just tell you a little bit about all of these. Certainly, dyslexia affects the accuracy and rate of reading both real words as well as pseudo words. It affects phonological decoding, it affects oral reading, it affects written spelling. Why? Because all of these components require us to integrate the orthographic with the phonological. But in this case, if the weakness is in basic skills, often we find that children's oral language skills are good. So if we read something aloud to them, they're able to demonstrate comprehension. If you're looking at the oral and written language learning disability, all components are weak. Oral language skills, including comprehension, are impaired, in addition to those basic reading skills. Dysgraphia really impairs legibility and automaticity of handwriting, and also sometimes affects spelling. So some individuals might have a diagnosis of dysgraphia because of the impaired legibility and automaticity of handwriting. Some may have a weakness in handwriting and also a weakness in spelling. But let me just tell you, in this case, we want to find out if the student's reading difficulties are symptoms of the dyslexia, maybe it's dysgraphia, or maybe it's an overall language disability. So one of the things that Dr. Berninger talks about is that it's really important for us to understand which of the three word forms is deficient in terms of coding. With which of the word forms am I struggling? Because that really helps us to understand whether the diagnosis should be dyslexia, dysgraphia, or the language disability. So let me just show you what that looks like, and then I want to show you where I get all this information. On this one, if I struggle to code the visual information, I struggle with orthographic coding, typically that's going to be manifested as a weakness in handwriting. The legibility and automaticity of handwriting might also be manifested in spelling. If I am struggling with the orthographic and phonological, linking the orthographic to the phonological, it's going to be manifested as dyslexia and probably, more than likely, a weakness in both reading, decoding, as well as spelling. But because the understanding comprehension requires the integration of the orthographic, the phonological, and the morphological. If the breakdown is at that cross-coding with those three areas, that is really going to be manifested as a language weakness, a weakness in language comprehension, both written language as well as oral language. What often happens is children, when we start to teach basic skills in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, students who are struggling to link the orthographic to the phonological will have a really difficult time with oral reading as well as with spelling. What happens, I think, when they go to fourth grade and beyond, where the demands of the curriculum shift to comprehension, what they rely on then is more the morphological, getting meaning from context. What happens, though, I think, is even though they might be able to use the context to circumvent that weakness with the orthographic and the phonological, I think that continue to impact the spelling. Because children who are using the morphological and relying on that part really tend to have good language skills. They tend to have a really good vocabulary. So that's what they're using to understand what they're reading. With spelling, though, the well-developed language skills actually impact them negatively. Because, for example, if you think about, and some of these are really simple words. For example, if I have not coded the visual representation of the word women, if I'm really struggling with the orthographic component, what I'm going to rely on is what I hear. So I'm going to isolate every sound that I hear, and then I'm going to write each individual sound. So often individuals who really are able, who have good language skills, continue to struggle with the spelling because they have not coded the visual representation of the word exactly the way that it should be. But they'll do okay in writing because if you're looking at the content of their writing, you will say, well, I know exactly what he was trying to write because that word resembles the target word when I pronounce it. So that sentence will sound right. The other thing that Dr. Berninger talks about is the importance of looking at the working memory component. And I'm going to show you this document because I'd like you to be able to take a look at this document. To the extent that we have words that are part of the autonomous orthographic lexicon, that will allow us to read fluently and to spell fluently. When I see something, for example, I take in the information orthographically and I connect that to the words, the phonological word. I'm able to say it. I'm able to write it. So it's really important for us to understand that verbal working memory is engaged at all steps and that it really must proceed quickly. So why is the differential diagnosis important? It's important because the diagnosis really has implications for instruction. A student with dyslexia will need more systematic and explicit instruction in word decoding, but once they learn to decode, their comprehension tends to develop normally. I want to show you this other document that's part of the user's guide as well. Dyslexics can learn how to read and write, and teachers can teach them. And then I also want to show you some of these lessons. And then she talks about the instruction that you use for word decoding, and you recognize some of this because we used this at Tier 2 as well. Well, we used it, actually, I showed you at Tier 1, looking at decoding, silent reading for meaning, and then the subword level. Students with a language learning disability will need systematic, explicit instruction in oral language, especially focusing on morphological and syntactic awareness. So if you're working with a child in 5th grade who is still struggling to link the phonological with the orthographic, we might want to implement some bypass strategies, really focusing on the meaning, teaching children to use parts of words and to use sentence structure to actually identify the meaning of a certain passage. A student with dysgraphia will need systematic, explicit instruction in both handwriting and spelling. So again, you want to try to understand why. What causes that weakness in naming words accurately or in comprehension? She also provides information on the differential diagnosis of math calculation skills, dyscalculia. And again, on this one, recognize disorder. Certainly if I'm struggling with math, it's math calculation, but it also requires working memory. So it might be that if you ask me to solve problems, or even if I read the problem myself, 26 and 49, for example, I read that and you ask me to write the answer, and I am saying this in my head. I'm mentally manipulating. I'm adding these numbers in my head, and I might give you an incorrect answer. Is it because of a procedural error? I don't know that my result should be larger than either of these numbers. Is it procedural? Is it conceptual? Or might it be a working memory problem? So So if there is a weakness with mental calculation, or a child is referred because mental calculation and working memory is weak, I ask you a question, I want you to tell me the answer quickly, and the child also struggles to calculate or to perform computation on paper using paper and pencil, there are many processes that might affect that. Might be fluency in counting, might be the working memory component, might be numeric coding in working memory of the visual symbols for that writing piece, might be the numeral writing. I know the answer, but I can't write it down because of a weakness in visual motor integration. Might, again, that link between the phonological and the orthographic, or might it be the fluency component? I can do it accurately, but I am not working at the level of automaticity. Again, she's presented a document of differential diagnosis, the working memory in math component, recognizing that there must be the integration between the orthographic, so you encode the information, you write it down, you say it to yourself, or maybe you say it to yourself and then you say it out loud. So the numeric and orthographic coding in working memory are constantly engaged as we're trying to store the symbols, just like you're trying to store the symbols in reading. So you're looking at the working memory demands from math as being very similar conceptually to the working memory demands for reading, because both involve, at certain grade levels, symbolic information. And then she tells us what we can do if we identify that the student is struggling because of a weakness in retrieving facts. The student might be struggling to switch attention from one operation to another. You might want to present sometimes a number of problems just using one operation. Teach the student to name the operation is another way. Often, if you are thinking about some students who can look, they do better when they look at the information and then give you a written response. Sometimes they might perform more effectively if they can look and say and then write. So again, sometimes when I say it out loud, that might be a different modality through which I receive the input. And she talks about different modalities, using multiple modalities to teach automaticity, and then also using some executive function kinds of procedures, like using selective reminding. Okay, let's see here. All right, I want to show you where I got most of this information. Most of this information is coming from the PAL2 User's Guide. And if you have the PAL2 kit, the PAL2 User's Guide comes on a CD-ROM in the kit itself. The PAL2 User's Guide includes everything I just talked about, and I sent you the table of contents, which is here. When you look at this, sometimes I think it's a little overwhelming to navigate, so I like to print out the table of contents because that has been helpful to me as I'm trying to find a document. But you can go up here and expand all of these, and then you'll see everything that's included in this user's guide. So I print out the table of contents first, and I'll go back to collapsing. In part one, it really gives you information about who would use the PAL2. Part two talks about the reading, writing, math domains. Part three here tells you about the subtest, the essentials of administering the subtest. But one of the things that I want to show you on this one, some of the resources I just talked about. You notice here is Tier 1 Universal Screening, Intervention in Progress Monitoring. I want to pull up some components from Tier 1 to show you. The first is preventing reading disabilities. Then there is the writing disabilities, the math disabilities. So I'm just going to pull this one up, and then I want to open up a PDF version of it because it makes it easier to see, I think. Then that's going to click down here. So this is the PDF version of that one. And what I just showed you in terms of the skills we expect students to master at different grade levels is included. I pulled it from this document. And then you move forward in this document, and you'll see the response to early intervention. Again, the lessons that you'd use at different grade levels. Again, all of that information for reading, writing, as well as math was pulled from that Tier 1 document. And then in Tier 2, this is your problem-solving consultation document. And again, on this one, I'm just going to pull up the reading one to show you. Here is your reading document. It takes a minute to load. I typically like to just save these to my desktop so that I don't have to come back every time and open up the user's guide. So on this one, essentially, we give you that problem-solving consultation process, the different steps, the initial interview with the teacher, the observation, the matrix for selecting subtests to identify the nature of the reading problem, the branching diagnosis is all included here. There are some interview forms that are included toward the back of this particular document, like here, for example, a letter that you can use to get the teacher to submit the referral. So a number of different components included here. But one component that I find interesting, certainly because you're thinking about differential diagnosis, is when you look at the Tier 3 component down here. I'm just going to look at the reading one first, here, diagnosing reading problems. And while that loads, let me see, on this one. Okay, did it give me a PDF? Okay, here we go. This one, reading through this one, I was absolutely blown away to think about. I mean, I worked as a school psychologist for years, and I've never conceptualized what I was doing in schools quite this way. That triangle I just showed you, thinking in terms about what exactly are we doing as we're reading. And, of course, once we're reading fluently, we don't isolate the component cognitive processes that are involved, but certainly for individuals who are struggling with reading, it's really important for us to be able to identify if the breakdown is because of the orthographic, the phonological, or maybe the link between the two. And then she proceeds in this document to talk about how working memory is involved with that coding of phonological, orthographic, and morphological information. And she goes on to talk about the importance of the phonological loop, the importance of the executive functions component. It's important for us to be able to switch attention or mental set in working memory, and how sometimes it's difficult to read because of a weakness with the executive function component. Like, I'm not able to inhibit, I'm focusing on a component of the task, which is what you're not asking me to do right now. For example, if I show you a word written in green and I tell you not to read the word, I showed you a word, so your first inclination is you want to name the word, but I don't want you to do that. I want you to name the color in which the word is written. So again, my children struggle to inhibit their initial response, and might that impact their ability to read? Are they not monitoring what they're reading, updating, revising? So really looking at the executive functions that are involved when you're thinking about encoding as well as retrieval. And then the last one I want to show you, you can get tons of resources right here under Part 7, other resources for PAL2 users. There are case studies for Tier 2 as well as 3. There are some printable instructional resources. I just want to pull up this one, because most everything that I just showed you comes from one of these documents. Here are the reading and writing lessons. There are lessons for phonological awareness, orthographic awareness. There are handouts for teachers and parents. There's the PAL Guide for Intervention. Let me see where that one is. The PAL Guide for Intervention. Okay. There are the handwriting lessons, the research-supported reading and writing lessons, the reproducible manual for the reading and writing lessons, and maybe that's under here, other reading and interventions. Okay. I'm trying to find where the oh, here it is. This is the the PAL Guides for Interventions, where she describes the evidence on which her interventions are based. So a number of different components that you might want to pull from here and download and save somewhere. These are huge documents, some of them, so you probably don't want to print them out. The Guides for Intervention is actually available in hardcover because that was part of the original PAL before we published the second edition. And so were the research-based reading and writing lessons. So they're also available in hard copy, but everything that I showed you here today is part of this user's guide. Okay, I'm going to get out of this here for a second, see if there's anything else that I need to tell you. Okay, then the other resources. Okay, technical properties. Actually, the stimulus book for the administration is part of the user's guide. The manuals are part of the user's guide. For pseudoword decoding, the way you pronounce the words are included here. A little document that you could play to listen to how you would pronounce some of those words. So a number of different components are included here with the user's guide. Okay. I don't think I saw any questions come through. But if you have any questions after we conclude the webinar, please feel free to send them my way, and I'll be sure to respond to them in writing. I hope that you have a sense of how you can use the PAL2 system to start with the screening component, then moving to more detailed assessment to try to understand why students might be struggling, why the students might be struggling. And once you identify why, Dr. Berninger believes that being able to describe why a student is struggling to read will let us know exactly what we need to do. If the weakness is phonological awareness, I go to the lessons for phonological awareness. So the information on why, the process component that might be involved, is really important because it'll drive you directly to the intervention. Diana was asking if the user's guide is in hardcover. The answer to that is no. The only part of that, and I typically do print out the table of contents, but a lot of what is included in the user's guide is available in hardcover. The major document, the books, are available in hardcover. The other components are maybe 20 pages, so I think those can be printed out more readily. And again, I mentioned the stimulus books are in the user's guide, and those come in hard copy as part of the kit, as well as the manuals are part of the kit. So not every part of the user's guide is available in hard copy. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. And if you have questions following this, please, my email address is here. Feel free to send me an email message. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Have a good evening wherever you are, or morning.
Thank you. Please stand by.